The most shocking truth about power is that you are often at your most vulnerable when you believe you are at your most secure. This is a lesson written in blood on the cold, rain-slicked streets of New York City, a lesson that a man named Paul Castellano learned in the most final of ways on a December evening in 1985. But to understand the profound silence that followed the gunshots outside Sparks Steak House, one must first understand the decades of ambition, calculation, and sheer force of will that built the man who would be executed there. His story is not merely one of a crime boss, it is a Shakespearean drama of American ambition, a slow-burning fuse that traced its way from the quiet, desperate struggles of an immigrant family to the gaudy, oppressive throne of the American underworld. It is a tale of a rise so meticulous and a fall so precipitous that it defies belief, a reminder that in the world of organized crime, the crown is never truly yours to keep, it is only yours to borrow until someone with more ambition and less patience decides to take it. Our journey into this shadowy empire begins not with a bang, but with a quiet birth in the throes of another world, a world far removed from the glittering towers of Manhattan that would one day bow to his influence. Paul Castellano entered this world on June 26, 1915, in the borough of Brooklyn, a place that was, at the time, a chaotic melting pot of immigrants all chasing the same elusive dream. His parents, Concetta and Giuseppe Castellano, were Sicilian immigrants, part of that great wave of hope that crashed upon American shores seeking a better life, only to find themselves mired in the same struggles they had hoped to leave behind. They settled in the tough neighborhood of Bensonhurst, a place where the line between survival and crime was often blurred into invisibility. Young Paul grew up in this environment, a crucible that forged many a gangster, watching as his father worked as a butcher, a trade that involved not just the carving of meat but an intimate understanding of value, supply, and the demands of a hungry community. This was his first education in commerce, but his second, more potent education was happening on the streets outside his door. He saw how local toughs exerted control, how protection money was levied, and how a well-placed threat could be more effective than a well-argued contract. The Castellano family, however, had a connection that would set their destiny apart from the other struggling families in the neighborhood. They were related by marriage to the Mangano family, and specifically to a man who was quietly becoming one of the most powerful forces in the American criminal landscape, Vincent Mangano. This familial link was Paul's golden ticket, his entry point into a world that operated in the shadows of the legitimate one. It was through this connection that his older brother, Constantino, became involved in the burgeoning criminal activities of what would eventually be known as the Gambino crime family. Paul, perhaps seeing the volatility of a purely street-level existence, initially chose a different path, one that seemed to blend the legitimate lessons from his father with the illicit opportunities presented by his family connections. He dove into the meat business, not as a simple butcher, but as an entrepreneur. He started a wholesale poultry market, and it was here that Paul Castellano, the businessman, began to emerge. He possessed a sharp, analytical mind, one that understood numbers, supply chains, and market forces. He was not a loud, backslapping salesman, he was quiet, observant, and calculating. He understood that true power wasn't always about being the loudest voice in the room, but often about being the one who controlled the resources everyone else needed. His legitimate business, however, was merely the visible tip of a much larger, submerged iceberg. The wholesale trade was perfect for money laundering and for exerting influence. He could use his trucks for illicit shipments, his cash-heavy business could absorb illegal profits, and his position as a supplier gave him leverage over countless restaurants and stores. This was the duality that would define Castellano's entire career, the public face of a successful businessman, and the private reality of a cunning criminal. His intelligence and, crucially, his family ties did not go unnoticed. The boss of the family, then under the control of Albert Anastasia, the notorious Lord High Executioner of Murder Incorporated, saw potential in the quiet, serious young man. Castellano was brought deeper into the fold, not as a mere soldier, but as someone with managerial potential. He was given responsibilities that played to his strengths, overseeing gambling rackets, loan sharking operations, and the burgeoning illicit economies in the neighborhoods he knew so well. He proved to be efficient, reliable, and, most importantly, discreet. He didn't seek the spotlight, he sought results. While other gangsters were flashy and prone to violent outbursts, Castellano was methodical. He believed that violence was a tool, not a pastime, to be used only when absolutely necessary and always as a last resort. This philosophy, this preference for boardroom tactics over back-alley brawls, set him apart and marked him for a leadership role. He was rising through the ranks not on a trail of bodies, but on a ledger of profits. His star continued to rise when, in 1957, a seismic shift occurred in the underworld. Albert Anastasia was brutally murdered in a barber shop at the Park Sheraton Hotel, a hit that was orchestrated by Carlo Gambino and his allies. This assassination cleared the path for Gambino to assume control of the family, which would henceforth bear his name. For Paul Castellano, this was a pivotal moment. He was not just a distant relative, he was a trusted confidant. His sister, Catherine, was married to Carlo Gambino. This cemented his position as part of the inner circle, part of the royal family of this criminal empire. He was no longer just a capable earner, he was family. Carlo Gambino, a man who shared Castellano's disdain for unnecessary flash and his preference for quiet, relentless expansion, saw a kindred spirit in his brother-in-law. Castellano became Gambino's most trusted aide, his underboss, the second in command of the most powerful criminal organization in the United States. Together, they steered the family away from the volatile, headline-grabbing wars of the past and towards a more corporate model of crime. They focused on infiltrating unions, particularly the trucking and construction industries, on massive gasoline tax fraud schemes, and on cementing their control over the New York waterfront. This was the era of the silent, sophisticated mobster, and Paul Castellano was its archetype. He was the brains behind the brawn, the strategist in the shadows, patiently waiting for his time to come, all while building his own power base, his own network of loyalists, and his own immense, if hidden, fortune. The stage was being set for a reign that would be as ambitious as it was doomed, a reign that would end not in a quiet retirement, but in a storm of betrayal and bullets, under the neon lights of a steakhouse, in full view of a city that never sleeps. The transition of power within the Gambino crime family was never going to be a matter of public debate or democratic process. It was a carefully orchestrated succession planned in the shadows by a man who understood the fragility of power better than anyone. Carlo Gambino, the quiet, unassuming mastermind who had built an empire on a foundation of silence and fear, was nearing the end of his life, and the question of who would inherit his throne was the single most pressing issue in the American underworld. The obvious choice, to many on the outside looking in, would have been Aniello Delacroce, the family's underboss and a formidable, street-savvy gangster who commanded the unwavering loyalty of the family's rugged soldiers and captains. Delacroce was the public face of the family's muscle, a man who understood the language of the streets, who had done time in prison, and who embodied the old-school mafia ethos of honor, respect, and brutal retaliation. He was the ID of the Gambino family, and his faction was large, powerful, and impatient. Yet, Carlo Gambino saw the future differently. He looked at the changing landscape of America, at the increasing scrutiny from federal investigators, and he concluded that the future of the mafia lay not in the bloody streets of Little Italy, but in the polished boardrooms of legitimate and quasi-legitimate businesses. He saw in his brother-in-law, Paul Castellano, the perfect instrument for this transition. Castellano was not a street brawler, he was a corporate raider in a world of thugs. He shared Gambino's vision of a criminal enterprise that was insulated, sophisticated, and nearly invisible. He understood high finance, complex rackets, and the immense profits to be reaped from the infiltration of industries like construction, garbage hauling, and food distribution. So, in a move that shocked many and angered more than a few, Carlo Gambino bypassed his own underboss and named Paul Castellano as his successor. When Gambino finally passed away in 1976 from a heart attack, the will of the deceased boss was enforced with ruthless efficiency by a powerful alliance of family elders and other crime family bosses who respected Gambino's final wishes. Paul Castellano was installed as the new head of the Gambino crime family, and to placate the dangerous Delacroce faction, a unique power-sharing structure was put in place. Delacroix would remain as underboss, but his authority would be largely confined to the family's traditional criminal activities in Manhattan: gambling, loan sharking, and prostitution. Castellano, as the boss, would focus on the big picture, the high-level corruption, and the vast, lucrative rackets that he had helped pioneer. This arrangement was a powder keg waiting for a spark. It created two distinct power centers within one family, a schism between the old guard and the new, between the streets and the suites. Castellano, now known in the press as the Howard Hughes of the mob or Big Paulie, due to his imposing physical stature and reclusive nature, immediately began to act like the CEO he believed himself to be. He moved his operational headquarters away from the social clubs of Little Italy and into a sprawling, white brick mansion on Toad Hill in Staten Island, the wealthiest neighborhood in New York City. This estate, which he pretentiously named the White House, was a fortress and a symbol of his remove from the grimy realities of his underlings' lives. He surrounded himself with a new breed of advisor, men like Tommy Bellotti, his brutish and fiercely loyal bodyguard, and Joe Gallo, his consigliere, who shared his corporate mindset. He began issuing edicts that alienated the old-school mobsters. He forbade made men from dealing in narcotics, a decree born not from morality but from pragmatism, as drug trafficking carried massive prison sentences and attracted intense federal heat that threatened his more sophisticated operations. This ban, however, cut off a major source of income for the soldiers in Delacroix's crew, men like the ambitious and flashy John Gotti, who saw the drug trade as easy money and resented the boss who was too good to get his hands dirty. Castellano lived an increasingly isolated and opulent life, holding court at his Staten Island mansion where he would lecture his captains on business ethics and profit margins, often while wearing a silk bathrobe. He seemed to lose touch with the very nature of his power, which was ultimately rooted in fear and loyalty, not in business acumen. He demanded absolute obedience and a cut of all profits, but he offered little in return to the men who risked their lives on the front lines. He was seen as greedy, arrogant, and disconnected. The resentment festered, particularly within the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Ozone Park, Queens, the base of operations for Aniello Delacroix and his protégé, John Gotti. Gotti, a charismatic and vicious gangster with movie star looks and a penchant for expensive suits, represented everything Castellano despised. He was loud, flashy, a magnet for law enforcement attention, and deeply involved in the very narcotics trade Castellano had forbidden. Gotti saw Castellano not as a visionary, but as a weak, pretentious old man who was stealing money from the real earners of the family. For years, the simmering tension was held in check by the presence and authority of Aniello Delacroix, who, despite his own differences with Castellano, maintained a fragile peace. Delacroix was a man of the old code, and that code demanded respect for the boss. But in December 1985, that final restraining bolt gave way. Aniello Delacroix died of cancer. With the underboss gone, there was no one left to act as a buffer between the increasingly isolated king in his White House and the hungry, ambitious prince waiting in the wings. John Gotti knew that with Delacroix dead, it was only a matter of time before Castellano moved to dismantle his crew, to bring him to heel for his continued flouting of the drug rule, or perhaps to eliminate him altogether. The stage was now set. The corporate boss, who believed his power was absolute, was about to learn a brutal lesson from the streets he had so arrogantly left behind. The fuse was burning its last few inches, and the explosion would be loud, public, and would forever change the face of organized crime. The death of Aniello Delacroix did not just create a power vacuum, it shattered the fragile tectonic plate upon which Paul Castellano's entire reign was built. For years, the simmering resentment between the family's two factions had been suppressed by Delacroix's formidable presence, his old-world authority acting as a dam holding back a tidal wave of mutiny. With that dam gone, the waters of insurrection began to swirl with violent intent, and at their center was John Gotti, a man who saw not a crisis, but the opportunity of a lifetime. Castellano, isolated in his Staten Island fortress, seemed to misunderstand the nature of the moment entirely. Instead of moving to consolidate his power through diplomacy or a swift, decisive strike, he retreated further into his corporate delusions. He saw Delacroix's death as a chance to finally restructure the family entirely in his own image, to purge it of the unpredictable, street-level elements he so despised. His immediate focus was not on the grieving, volatile Bergen crew, but on the mechanics of succession. He appointed his loyal and equally despised bodyguard, Tommy Bellotti, as the new underboss, a move that was seen as a profound insult by every seasoned captain in the family. Bellotti was a thug, a low-level enforcer with a violent temper but no strategic mind. His only qualification was his slavish devotion to Castellano. To the old-school mafiosi, this was the ultimate betrayal of their meritocratic code, a sign that Castellano valued sycophancy over capability. Gotti, now the de facto leader of the powerful Manhattan faction, watched these developments with a cold, calculating fury. He knew the clock was ticking. Castellano had long been suspicious of Gotti's narcotics dealings, and with his primary protector in the ground, Gotti was certain that a summons to the White House was imminent, and that it would not end with a handshake. He understood the old laws of the jungle better than the business school graduate in the mansion on the hill: strike first, or be struck. The plan for a coup began to crystallize in the shadows, in the back rooms of social clubs and in hushed conversations in moving cars. Gotti found willing allies in other disaffected Gambino captains, men like Sammy, the Bull, Gravano, who, despite being a prolific killer, was also a pragmatic businessman who had grown tired of Castellano's incessant greed and heavy-handed demands for a larger share of their earnings. Gravano, who had built a lucrative empire in the construction industry, particularly resented how Castellano would muscle in on his deals, demanding tribute without providing any real value or protection. To these men, Castellano was no longer a boss to be respected, he was a parasite to be excised. The conspiracy was a masterpiece of treachery, planned with the cold precision of a military operation. They chose their moment with care. They knew Castellano's patterns, his habits, his vulnerabilities. They knew that on the evening of December 16, 1985, he would be traveling into Manhattan for a dinner meeting at Spark Steak House, a high-end restaurant in Midtown, a place he frequented precisely because it was far from the gritty neighborhoods he associated with his underlings. The location was both an advantage and a profound symbol of his disconnect. The hit team, a group of carefully selected and trusted assassins, began to assemble in the cold, early evening darkness. The scene outside Sparks was a study in mundane city life: Christmas shoppers bustling along East 46th Street, the glow of neon signs reflecting off wet pavement, the sound of traffic providing a constant, urban hum. Into this ordinary New York evening, the conspirators injected their extraordinary violence. They positioned themselves as ghosts in the machine, blending into the background, their movements calm and rehearsed. Some acted as lookouts, others as the primary shooters. They waited, their breath misting in the frigid air, their hearts pounding not with fear, but with the adrenaline of impending history. Meanwhile, Paul Castellano was being driven into the city, ensconced in the plush leather interior of his black Lincoln Town car, with Tommy Bellotti at the wheel. It was the ultimate image of his reign, isolated, mobile, and utterly unaware of the betrayal hurtling toward him. He was likely thinking about the dinner meeting, about the business at hand, about consolidating his power and finally bringing the rebellious elements of his family to heel. He had no idea that his own captains had already tried him, convicted him, and sentenced him to death in absentia. As the Lincoln pulled up to the curb outside Spark Steak House, the world slowed to a crawl for the men watching. Castellano and Bellotti stepped out of the car, two powerful men in expensive overcoats, exposed on a public street. They were completely vulnerable, their security a myth shattered in an instant. This was the moment. From the crowd of anonymous pedestrians, the hit team emerged. There were no words, no dramatic pronouncements. There was only the sudden, shocking roar of gunfire, a brutal staccato that cut through the holiday cheer and sent people screaming and scattering for cover. Paul Castellano, the man who had sought to build a corporate empire, was cut down in a hail of bullets, his body slumping against the cold metal of his car. Tommy Bellotti met the same fate, his loyalty earning him a death sentence alongside his boss. In less than a minute, it was over. The shooters melted back into the city from which they came, leaving behind 2 dead men, a scene of chaos, and a message that was as clear as it was terrifying: the king was dead. The assassination was not just a murder, it was a political statement, a revolution carried out with .38 caliber arguments. John Gotti, who had orchestrated the entire event from a car parked nearby, watching the aftermath with grim satisfaction, had not only eliminated a rival, he had shattered the old order. He had proven that the most powerful crime boss in America could be killed in the heart of Manhattan, on a crowded street, and that there would be no immediate retribution. The public execution was a demonstration of his own power, his audacity, and his contempt for the quiet, cautious ways of the past. For Paul Castellano, his rise and his reign ended on that cold street, a victim of the very street violence he had sought to rise above. His grand vision of a corporate mafia died with him, replaced by the brash, flashy, and ultimately self-destructive era of John Gotti. The Godfather had fallen, not in a secret meeting or a remote warehouse, but under the bright lights of the city he had sought to control, a stark and bloody lesson in the fact that in the world of organized crime, no amount of money or influence can ever truly insulate you from the ambitions of the hungry. The immediate aftermath of the gunshots outside Sparks Steakhouse was a vacuum of sound, a stunned silence that was quickly filled by the screams of pedestrians and the blaring of car horns, a chaotic symphony marking the violent end of an era. Paul Castellano lay dead on the pavement, his blood seeping into the cracks of the city he had helped to rule from the shadows, his corporate dreams extinguished in a burst of primal violence. But the true significance of those moments extended far beyond the gruesome scene on East 46th Street. This was not merely an assassination, it was a meticulously planned coup d'état, and its success hinged on what happened next. As the shooters disappeared into the New York evening, their work was only half done. The other, equally critical phase of the operation was the swift and uncompromising consolidation of power. John Gotti, who had watched the hit from a parked car with his trusted associate Sammy Gravano, did not linger. He immediately set in motion a well-rehearsed plan to seize the throne of the Gambino crime family before any potential rivals could even process the news. Speed and audacity were his weapons, and he wielded them with breathtaking efficiency. While police sirens wailed towards the crime scene, Gotti's network was already activating. Messages were sent through a clandestine web of associates, summoning the family's most powerful captains to a meeting that very night. The message was clear and left no room for debate: there was a new reality, and attendance was mandatory. The location was often a social club in Brooklyn, a place where the old rules were being rewritten in real time. When the captains arrived, they were met not with negotiation, but with a fait accompli. Gotti, now flanked by Gravano and other key conspirators, presented himself not as a candidate for boss, but as the boss. He framed the murder of Castellano not as a treacherous act, but as a necessary correction, a move to save the family from a leader who had grown weak, greedy, and disconnected from the men who did the real work. He spoke of Castellano's greed, his isolation in Staten Island, his disrespect for the earners, and his dangerous edicts against the narcotics trade that lined their pockets. He painted a picture of a boss who had lost his way, and of a brave action taken to restore the family to its rightful strength and prosperity. This narrative, repeated and reinforced, was a masterstroke of political manipulation. For the captains in that room, the choice was stark and terrifying: swear allegiance to the new, powerful, and clearly ruthless regime, or be considered a loyalist of the dead king and face the consequences. There was no vote. There was only the unspoken threat that hung in the air, the same threat that had just been executed on a public street. One by one, the captains fell in line. The fear of being next, combined with the promise of a more profitable and less restrictive future under Gotti, proved to be an irresistible combination. The transfer of power, which in the legitimate world could take months of transition, was completed in a matter of hours. The Gambino family, the most powerful criminal organization in the nation, had a new boss. Gotti's next move was to control the public narrative. He understood the power of image in a way Castellano never did. While Castellano shunned the spotlight, Gotti embraced it. He became a media sensation, the Teflon Don, always impeccably dressed in Brioni suits and cashmere overcoats, smiling for the cameras, and openly mocking the law enforcement officials who pursued him. He held court on the sidewalks of Little Italy, granting interviews, and becoming a perverse folk hero to a segment of the public that was fascinated by his brazen defiance. This public persona was a calculated strategy. It projected an image of invincibility, both to the public and, more importantly, to his own men and his rivals in the other four families. It sent a message that the old rules of secrecy and quiet power were obsolete. The era of Gotti was to be one of flamboyance, arrogance, and open challenge to the authorities. However, beneath the glamorous media facade, the reality of Gotti's reign was one of paranoia and brutal consolidation. To ensure his grip on power was absolute, he began a systematic purge of anyone whose loyalty to Castellano was even remotely suspected. This was not the corporate restructuring Castellano had envisioned, this was a bloody reign of terror. Associates and captains who had been close to the previous administration were called in for meetings from which they never returned. Their bodies turned up in car trunks, in vacant lots, or simply disappeared. The message was unequivocal: dissent would be met with immediate and final punishment. Gotti rewarded his co-conspirators handsomely, making Sammy Gravano his underboss, solidifying the alliance that had made the coup possible. He also centralized control, dismantling the semi-autonomous power structure that had existed under Castellano and Delacroce. All major decisions, all significant profits, now flowed directly to him. The family was being remade in his image, centralized, violent, and spectacularly public. The other New York crime families, the Genovese, the Lucchese, the Colombo, and the Bonanno, were shocked by the audacity of the hit. Such a public execution of a sitting boss was unprecedented and threatened to bring down massive heat on everyone. Traditionally, they might have intervened, punishing the usurpers for violating the sacred rules of their secret society. But Gotti's swift and ruthless consolidation of power left them with few options. He was now too powerful, his family too large, and his network of loyal killers too feared. To move against him would have meant starting a war they could not be sure of winning, a war that would have drawn even more law enforcement attention. Reluctantly, and with deep misgivings, the Commission, the ruling body of the American Mafia, recognized John Gotti as the new boss of the Gambino family. In doing so, they legitimized the murder of Paul Castellano and endorsed a new, more volatile and dangerous era for organized crime. The quiet, calculating, boardroom approach of Carlo Gambino and Paul Castellano was dead, replaced by the roaring, headline-grabbing, and ultimately self-destructive spectacle of John Gotti's rule. The fall of Paul Castellano was now complete, his legacy not one of corporate innovation, but of a stark warning about the perils of losing touch with the brutal foundations of one's own power. The reign of John Gotti, born from the blood of Paul Castellano, was a dramatic and turbulent era that stood in stark contrast to the quiet, calculating dominion of his predecessor. Where Castellano had sought invisibility and corporate respectability, Gotti craved the spotlight and cultivated a public image of invincibility that made him a household name. He became the Teflon Don, a title earned after several high-profile trials resulted in acquittals, seemingly confirming his untouchable status in the eyes of both the public and his own criminal empire. He held court on Mulberry Street in Little Italy, smiling for cameras, dressed in impeccably tailored suits that became his signature, and openly mocking the law enforcement agents who tailed him. This brazen defiance was a double-edged sword. It cemented his legend among a certain segment of the population and intimidated his rivals, but it also made him the #1 target of every federal agency in the country. The FBI, humiliated by their repeated failures to convict him, redoubled their efforts, launching an unprecedented surveillance operation. They bugged his social club, the Rave Night, in Little Italy, and followed his every move, determined to find the chink in his armor. Meanwhile, within the Gambino family, Gotti's rule grew increasingly paranoid and despotic. The man who had rallied support by decrying Castellano's greed now became notorious for his own avarice, demanding exorbitant cuts from his captain's earnings while often providing little in return. He violated the very mafia codes he claimed to be upholding, ordering hits on made men without the proper consultations and rulings from the Commission, the Mafia's governing body. His violent temper became legendary, and Capos lived in fear of his whims, aware that a single perceived slight could lead to a death sentence. The glamorous facade began to crack under the weight of his own recklessness. The turning point, the moment the Teflon began to peel, came from an unexpected quarter, his most trusted ally, his underboss Sammy, the Bull, Gravano. Gravano, who had been instrumental in the plot to kill Castellano, had grown increasingly disillusioned with Gotti. He watched as Gotti's ego and carelessness attracted relentless federal scrutiny that was crippling the family's operations. He saw that as Gotti took larger and larger shares of his construction business profits. The final straw came when Gravano discovered that Gotti was discussing him on the secretly recorded tapes from the rave nightclub, making disparaging remarks and even contemplating his murder. Faced with the certainty of a life sentence if convicted and the betrayal by the man he helped make boss, Gravano made a calculated, earth-shattering decision. He would break the sacred oath of omerta and become a government witness. Gravano's decision to flip was the knockout blow to the Gotti regime. He provided the FBI with an insider's account of decades of criminal activity, including the detailed planning and execution of the Paul Castellano murder, a crime for which Gotti had never been charged. Armed with Gravano's testimony and the damning audio recordings of Gotti himself discussing murders and criminal schemes, the federal government built an airtight case. In 1992, John Gotti was convicted on a raft of charges, including murder and racketeering, and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Teflon Don was finally convicted. His reign ended not by a rival gangster's bullet, but by the justice system he had mocked for so long. He was sent to the United States Penitentiary at Marion, Illinois, the most secure federal prison in the country, where he spent his remaining years in solitary confinement, dying of cancer in 2002. His legacy was one of chaos and destruction, a cautionary tale about the dangers of hubris. The Gambino family, which had been the most powerful and wealthy criminal organization in America under Carlo Gambino and, initially, Paul Castellano, was left shattered and weakened by the Gotti years. The public spectacle and the subsequent prosecutions had decimated its leadership and disrupted its operations. In the end, the coup that Gotti had engineered, the murder that had been intended to seize and solidify power, ultimately set in motion the chain of events that would lead to the precipitous decline of the very empire he sought to rule. The story of Paul Castellano and John Gotti is thus a profound parable about power, its acquisition, and its preservation. Castellano's fall was a result of his disconnect from the gritty realities of his power base, a lesson that authority cannot be sustained through isolation and avarice alone. Gotti's fall, however, was a result of the opposite extreme, an overabundance of ego, a reckless disregard for tradition and caution, and a failure to understand that in the shadows, longevity is achieved through silence, not spectacle. The two men, forever linked by the violence of December 16, 1985, represent the two doomed poles of criminal leadership, and their stories serve as the bookends to a pivotal and destructive chapter in the history of American organized crime. The downfall of John Gotti, while a spectacular and very public conclusion to the era he inaugurated with Paul Castellano's murder, was by no means the end of the Gambino crime family's story, but rather the beginning of a long, painful, and fragmented aftermath. In the wake of Gotti's life sentence, the family he had led with such flamboyant reckoning was left a shadow of its former self, a wounded giant bleeding from self-inflicted wounds and the relentless prosecutions that his very public profile had invited. The federal government, emboldened by its success in convicting the Teflon Don, turned its vast apparatus onto the rest of the organization, using the treasure trove of information provided by Sammy Gravano and the extensive evidence gathered through wiretaps to systematically dismantle the family's structure. Captains, soldiers, and associates who had operated with a degree of impunity found themselves facing lengthy prison sentences, forcing them to choose between decades behind bars or following Gravano's path and becoming informants themselves. This culture of flipping, once considered the ultimate sin, became almost commonplace, further eroding the foundation of trust and omerta that the entire mafia edifice was built upon. The family's leadership was thrown into a state of chaos and musical chairs. Gotti, from his prison cell, initially attempted to maintain control, installing his brother Peter as a front boss, but this was a short-lived and transparent maneuver that the government quickly disrupted. The subsequent years saw a series of bosses rise and fall, each one seemingly more short-lived and less powerful than the last. Men like John Jr. Gotti, the son of the jail Don, took the helm, but his reign was defined almost entirely by repeated indictments and trials, a constant state of legal warfare that prevented any real consolidation of power or rebuilding of the family's fortunes. The Gambino family was forced to adapt to a new, harsher reality. The days of brazenly running construction unions and operating massive, centralized gambling and loan sharking operations with impunity were over. The spotlight was too bright, the surveillance too sophisticated. To survive, the family had to fracture, to return to a more decentralized, cell-like structure where individual crews operated with greater autonomy, focusing on lower-profile, less flashy criminal enterprises that flew under the federal radar. They returned to their roots in neighborhood-based crimes, small-scale gambling, targeted extortion of local businesses, credit card fraud, and, despite Castellano's a significant presence in the narcotics trade, which remained too profitable to ignore entirely. The immense political corruption and control over major industries that had been the hallmark of the Castellano and Gambino eras became a distant memory, a golden age that the current generation of mobsters could only hear about in stories from aging, paranoid wise guys. The family's influence over the New York waterfront, once an absolute dominion, waned significantly. Their ability to deliver votes for politicians or to control entire sectors of the city's economy evaporated in the face of increased regulation, corporate oversight, and intense law enforcement focus. The modern Gambino family became a more localized, almost nostalgic criminal entity, its power diminished but not entirely extinguished, a ghost of its former self haunting the boroughs of a city that had largely moved on. The name Gambino no longer struck the same fear into the hearts of businessmen and politicians, it was now more associated with true crime documentaries and history books. This dramatic decline serves as the final, poignant chapter in the story that began with Paul Castellano's ambition. His vision of a corporate, insulated mafia was ultimately destroyed by the very street-level violence and ambition he sought to suppress. And the man who destroyed that vision, John Gotti, in his quest for glory and total control, ultimately became the architect of his own empire's ruin, proving that the loudest king often has the shortest reign. The legacy of the Castellano-Gotti War is therefore not just the story of two men, but a sweeping historical narrative about the evolution, and perhaps the beginning of the end, of traditional organized crime in America. It is a tale that demonstrates how internal rot, the cancers of greed, arrogance, and betrayal, can be far more destructive than any external enemy. The FBI and the federal prosecutors were merely the surgeons. The disease was born and cultivated within the heart of the family itself. The echoes of the gunshots outside Sparks Steakhouse did not just kill a man, they set in motion a chain of events that would cripple a criminal dynasty for generations, a stark and enduring reminder that in the ruthless calculus of power, no victory is ever truly final, and every throne is built on a foundation that can, and will, eventually crumble. The legacy of Paul Castellano, when viewed through the long lens of history, is a complex and deeply contradictory one, a tapestry woven with threads of shrewd business acumen, immense personal ambition, and a catastrophic failure to understand the fundamental nature of the world he inhabited. He was, in many ways, a man ahead of his time, yet also a prisoner of a past he could not escape. His grand vision for a corporatized mafia, an empire built on the quiet infiltration of legitimate industries and sophisticated financial fraud, was both his greatest strength and his fatal flaw. He correctly foresaw that the future of sustained criminal power lay not in the bloody street corners of Little Italy, but in the boardrooms and union halls that controlled the very lifeblood of New York City's economy. Under his stewardship, first as Carlo Gambino's right hand and then as boss, the family's wealth and influence reached unprecedented heights, penetrating the concrete industry, garbage hauling, the garment district, and the meat markets with a chilling efficiency. He was a master of this kind of high-level racketeering, understanding that controlling a union or an entire industry supply chain was infinitely more profitable and far less risky than 1,000 street-level robberies. He built his personal life in the image of this success, retreating behind the high walls of his Todt Hill mansion, a symbol of his remove from the grimy origins of his power. Yet, this very remove became the chink in his armor. In his quest to become a CEO, he forgot that he was, first and foremost, a mafia boss, and that his authority ultimately rested not on profit margins, but on fear, respect, and a keen understanding of the ambitions and grievances of the men beneath him. His ban on drug trafficking, while pragmatically motivated, was seen as an arrogant and greedy edict that deprived his soldiers of a major source of income. His preference for advisors like Tommy Bilotti, men of brute loyalty over strategic brilliance, alienated the old guard captains who valued merit and experience. His physical and emotional isolation from the social clubs where the lifeblood of the mafia, gossip, loyalty, and discontent, flowed freely, left him deaf to the rumblings of the mutiny being plotted by John Gotti and Sammy Gravano. He became a king who only heard the whispers of his courtiers, completely unaware of the roaring discontent in the provinces. In the end, Paul Castellano was a tragic figure, a man who mastered the complex calculus of high finance but failed the simple arithmetic of street-level power. He understood how to control a market, but he forgot how to control the hearts and minds of his own men. His assassination was not just a hit, it was a brutal rejection of his entire philosophy, a statement from the streets that the old ways of quiet, calculated power were no longer acceptable to a new, more impatient, and more violent generation. His death marked the end of an era of relative stability and the beginning of a period of chaotic, self-destructive spectacle that would ultimately cripple the organization he had helped build. The story of Paul Castellano is therefore a timeless parable about the nature of power itself, a reminder that no amount of wealth or influence can protect a leader who becomes disconnected from the source of their own authority. It is a lesson in the importance of perception, loyalty, and the grim reality that in a world governed by violence, the executive in the corner office is always vulnerable to the ambitious man in the street with a gun. His life and death continue to fascinate because they represent a pivotal, what if, in the history of organized crime. What if his corporate vision had prevailed? Would the Gambino family have become an even more deeply entrenched and untouchable entity? We will never know, because the ambitions of John Gotti ensured that particular future was erased in a hail of gunfire on a cold December evening, leaving behind only the ghost of a godfather who dreamed of a boardroom but died on the street. The story of Paul Castellano is far more than a simple chronicle of a mobster's life and death. It is a profound and unsettling mirror held up to the very nature of the American dream itself, revealing the dark and twisted path that ambition can take when fueled by insatiable greed and a hunger for absolute power. Castellano, the son of Sicilian immigrants, did not emerge from a vacuum. He was a product of a specific time and place, a world where the legitimate avenues to success often seemed closed to those on the outside, and where the criminal underworld offered a parallel, shadow economy with its own rules and its own brutal rewards. In this sense, his initial rise was a perversion of the immigrant narrative, a dark echo of the hustle and determination that defined so many striving families in early 20th century America. He took the lessons of his father's butcher shop, the value of controlling a vital resource, the importance of supply and demand, the power of leverage, and applied them to a far more sinister marketplace. He was, in his own warped way, a quintessential American entrepreneur, building a business from the ground up, but that business was predicated on extortion, violence, and corruption. His journey from the streets of Bensonhurst to the opulent mansion on Todt Hill is a dark fairy tale of success, a narrative that exposes the brutal underbelly of capitalism where monopolies are enforced not by superior products, but by the threat of a baseball bat or a bullet. This duality is what makes his story so enduringly fascinating and so deeply cautionary. He lived a life of stark contrasts, the respected neighborhood businessman who presided over a vast empire of misery, the family man who ordered the murders of other fathers and sons, the sophisticated connoisseur of fine living whose wealth was drenched in the blood of his enemies. He represented the ultimate corruption of the dream, the idea that success, no matter how ill-gotten, could wash away the sins committed to attain it. His sprawling Staten Island home, with its gaudy furnishings and obsessive security, was not just a residence, it was a fortress designed to keep the consequences of his actions at bay, a physical manifestation of his attempt to wall himself off from the very world he plundered. But the walls, both literal and metaphorical, could not save him. The same system that allowed him to flourish, a system built on ambition, betrayal, and ruthless competition, inevitably produced a challenger who was even more ambitious, more ruthless, and less burdened by the pretensions of legitimacy. John Gotti was, in a sense, the pure, unvarnished idea of this dark American dream, the brutal truth that Castellano tried to decorate with silk robes and corporate jargon. Gotti understood that at its core, this world was not about board meetings and profit shares, it was about fear, respect, and the willingness to unleash ultimate violence to get what you want. Castellano's murder was therefore a symbolic killing of the old, more complex dream by the new, simpler, and more terrifying one. It was a declaration that the facade of respectability was a weakness, and that raw, unadulterated power was the only true currency. The echoes of this struggle resonate far beyond the world of organized crime. It is a story about the tension between the old and the new, between tradition and disruption, between the established order and the hungry usurper. We see these dynamics play out in corporate takeovers, in political revolutions, and in the very fabric of social change. The tale of Castellano and Gotti is a Shakespearean drama dressed in fedoras and tailored suits, a timeless exploration of the corrupting influence of power and the inevitable downfall that awaits those who believe they have truly mastered their domain. It reminds us that no empire, whether legitimate or illicit, is immune to the forces of internal decay and external challenge. The rain-slicked street outside Sparks Steakhouse is not just a location in a crime story, it is a stage upon which the eternal play of ambition, betrayal, and mortality is performed, a stark reminder that in the relentless pursuit of power, the only true end is the one that waits for us all, often arriving suddenly and with brutal finality, just when we believe we are at the peak of our strength. The psychological portrait of Paul Castellano is a study in the slow, corrosive effects of absolute power, a gradual transformation from a shrewd, ambitious man into a paranoid and isolated monarch who ultimately lost touch with the very kingdom he ruled. To understand his downfall, one must delve into the mind of the man behind the mansion walls, a mind that became a gilded cage of its own making. In his early years, Castellano's intelligence was his greatest asset. He was a calculator, a strategist who preferred the quiet manipulation of finances and the strategic placement of threats over the messy and attention-drawing spectacle of violence. He possessed a deep-seated need for order and control, a desire to impose a corporate structure onto the chaotic and inherently volatile world of organized crime. This was not merely a business strategy, it was a reflection of his personality. He found the unpredictability of street-level thugs like John Gotti distasteful and dangerous, viewing them as uncontrollable variables in his carefully constructed equations of power. His ban on drug trafficking, for instance, was as much a psychological need for control and risk mitigation as it was a pragmatic decision. He could not abide the idea of his soldiers engaging in a trade that attracted such intense federal scrutiny and operated outside his direct, orderly oversight. This craving for control, however, began to mutate into something darker and more self-destructive as his power solidified. The isolation of his Toad Hill estate was both a physical and psychological reality. He retreated from the social clubs, the cramped, smoke-filled rooms where the vital currency of loyalty and rumor was traded. He began to believe his own myth, seeing himself not as a gangster who had done well, but as a legitimate business magnate who was somehow separate from the brutal foundations of his wealth. This grand self-deception was the crack in his armor. He surrounded himself with sycophants like Tommy Bellotti, men who reflected his own inflated self-image back at him, rather than trusted advisors who would challenge him and deliver hard truths from the streets. The old-school captains, men who had earned their positions through grit and loyalty, were pushed to the periphery, their wisdom and their warnings ignored. This created a dangerous feedback loop of affirmation, where Castellano's decisions grew increasingly out of touch with the realities of his family. His greed, often cited as a primary reason for the resentment against him, was also a psychological symptom of his isolation. The constant demand for larger tributes was not just about amassing wealth, it was a way of constantly testing and reaffirming his power, of feeling the submission of his underlings from a distance. He could no longer command respect through his physical presence or his street reputation, so he commanded it through financial extraction. This, in turn, fueled the very discontent that would lead to his murder. The plotters of the coup, Gotti and Gravano, were able to exploit this profound psychological disconnect. They painted him as a greedy, weak, and distant king who was unworthy of the throne, a narrative that resonated powerfully with the soldiers who felt exploited and disrespected. Castellano's failure to recognize the growing threat was not an intelligence failure, it was a failure of empathy and perception. He could not comprehend the depth of the ambition burning in Gotti, because he had lost the ability to see the world from the perspective of a hungry, ambitious man. He had forgotten what it was like to want, to strive, to covet the throne, because he had been sitting on it for too long. In his final days, he was likely consumed with the business of being a boss, the meetings, the tributes, the high-level schemes, while remaining utterly blind to the mortal danger brewing in his own ranks. The ultimate psychological tragedy of Paul Castellano is that he was killed by a version of his former self, the ambitious, ruthless, and street-smart young man he once was, who understood that power is not given, but taken. He became a victim of the very system he sought to control, a system that has no room for sentiment, for nostalgia, or for leaders who forget that their authority is written in sand, not carved in stone. His story is a haunting lesson in the importance of staying connected to the roots of one's power, and a stark warning that the walls we build for our protection can often become the walls of our own prison. The world in which Paul Castellano operated was not one of simple good and evil, but a complex ecosystem of shifting alliances, fragile loyalties, and a moral code that was as rigid as it was frequently betrayed. To fully grasp the context of his rise and fall, one must understand the intricate tapestry of the American Mafia in the mid-20th century, a secret society with its own laws, its own language, and its own brutal sense of justice. The five families of New York, Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno, were not just rival gangs, they were corporate entities in a bloody, perpetual competition for territory and profit, governed by a loose and often ignored governing body known as the Commission. This was the board of directors for organized crime, intended to mediate disputes and prevent all-out war, but it was a body steeped in its own corruption and self-interest. Castellano's ascent was deeply intertwined with the politics of this shadowy boardroom. His relationship with Carlo Gambino was not merely one of family, it was a strategic alliance that placed him at the very heart of this power structure. When Gambino engineered the hit on Albert Anastasia in 1957, it was a masterstroke of commission politics, a move that eliminated a volatile and dangerous rival and cleared the path for Gambino's own quiet, methodical style of leadership. Castellano learned from this that the most effective power was often wielded in silence, through manipulation and strategic alliance rather than through public displays of strength. He watched as Gambino, a man who looked like a humble accountant, became the most powerful criminal in America by understanding the levers of power better than anyone else. This was the environment that shaped Castellano's own philosophy. He saw the Mafia not as a collection of street thugs, but as a vast, clandestine corporation whose product was fear and whose customers were everyone from the corner grocery store to the largest construction firms in the city. His focus on infiltrating unions and industries was a direct result of this worldview. He understood that controlling the Teamsters Union, for example, was like controlling the circulatory system of the American economy. It gave him power over the movement of goods across the entire country. His forays into the concrete industry ensured that no building over a certain height could be poured in New York without the Gambino family receiving a tribute. This was macro-level crime, a form of institutional corruption that was far more damaging and pervasive than any number of bank robberies or street-level drug deals. It was also a strategy that required a different kind of soldier. Castellano valued men who could wear a suit, read a balance sheet, and negotiate with corrupt union officials and businessmen, not just those who could wield a baseball bat. This created a cultural schism within his own family, a divide between the old world and the new. The old world was represented by men like Aniello Delacroce, who believed in the sanctity of the street, the importance of omerta, and the direct, personal exercise of power. The New World was Castellano's vision, a faceless, corporate entity that operated from a distance. The conflict that killed him was, at its core, a culture war. John Gotti was not just a rival, he was the champion of the old way, a man who believed that the Mafia's strength lay in its visibility and its fearsome reputation, not in its ability to blend into the corporate landscape. Gotti's very public assassination of Castellano was therefore a rejection of the future his boss was building. It was a violent insistence that the Mafia must remain a thing of the streets, of social clubs and flashy suits and public defiance. In the end, the context of Castellano's story is the story of the Mafia itself at a critical crossroads. It was an organization trying to evolve, to become more sophisticated and insulated, but it was pulled back by the sheer gravitational force of its own violent origins. Castellano represented the path of evolution, a path that might have led to a more enduring, if more insidious, form of power. Gotti represented a return to the primal, a spectacular but ultimately self-immolating burst of flame. The tragedy is that both paths were doomed. The federal government, armed with new laws like the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations, RICO, Act, was becoming too sophisticated, too powerful. The world was changing, and the window for a vast, centralized criminal empire like the one Paul Castellano dreamed of was closing forever. His death did not just mark the end of a man, it marked the beginning of the end of an era, the last gasp of a certain kind of organized crime before it was fractured, diminished, and pushed to the margins of American society by the very forces of law, order, and modernity that he had tried so hard, and so futilely, to corrupt. The weapon that ultimately proved more devastating than any gun or betrayal in the war against the American Mafia was not wielded by a rival gangster, but by a legislator. The Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, known as RICO, became law in 1970, but its full, terrifying power was not truly unleashed until the 1980s, and it fundamentally altered the landscape upon which men like Paul Castellano and John Gotti had built their empires. For decades, prosecutors had been frustrated by the structure of organized crime. They could arrest and convict individual soldiers for specific crimes, a murder, an extortion, a robbery, but the bosses, insulated by layers of bureaucracy and protected by omerta, remained untouchable. They were like corporate CEOs, never directly handling the dirty work, always able to distance themselves from the violence and illegality carried out by their subordinates. RICO changed everything. It was a legal sledgehammer designed to smash the entire organization, not just prune its branches. The statute allowed prosecutors to connect the dots between a wide range of criminal acts, murder, extortion, gambling, bribery, and prove they were all part of a continuing criminal enterprise. Under RICO, the boss who ordered a murder could be held as responsible as the trigger man who carried it out. The penalties were draconian, decades in prison, mandatory sentences, and the complete seizure of all assets believed to be derived from criminal activity. This last provision was particularly terrifying to men like Castellano, who had spent a lifetime accumulating wealth and property. His Tote Hill mansion, his cars, his bank accounts, all of it could be taken by the government. Paul Castellano was one of the first high-profile targets of this new legal paradigm. The Mafia's traditional defense, silence and insulation, was suddenly obsolete. The FBI's intensive surveillance of Castellano, the bugging of his home and his cars, was all aimed at building a RICO case. They weren't just looking for evidence of a single crime, they were collecting the threads that would weave the tapestry of his entire criminal enterprise. The case they were assembling against him was monumental, a sprawling indictment that would detail his reign as the head of the Gambino family and charge him with a pattern of racketeering that included murder, conspiracy, extortion, and fraud. It was this impending legal doom that cast a long shadow over the final months of his life. The pressure was immense and unrelenting. He knew the walls were closing in, and this looming threat undoubtedly influenced his actions and his state of mind, making him more paranoid, more reclusive, and perhaps more desperate in his dealings with his own captains. The irony is profound and tragic. The very tool that was designed to bring him to justice, the RICO Act, may have inadvertently contributed to the environment that led to his murder. John Gotti and his co-conspirators, seeing their boss under this unprecedented legal siege, likely feared that a desperate Castellano might make deals, might flip, or might take actions to save himself that would jeopardize the entire family. The impending RICO case made Castellano look vulnerable, and in the Mafia, vulnerability is a death sentence. Gotti's coup was, in part, a preemptive strike against a leader he perceived as weakened by the federal government's new weapon. Yet, in a final, bitter twist of fate, RICO would also be the instrument that destroyed John Gotti. The same law that had hounded Castellano was used with even greater effect against the Teflon Don. The FBI's recordings from the Rave Night Social Club, combined with the testimony of Sammy Gravano, provided the perfect pattern of racketeering activity needed for a RICO conviction. Gotti's own words, his boasts about murders and criminal schemes, were woven into the tapestry that proved the existence of the continuing criminal enterprise he led. The law that Castellano had feared would cage him was the very law that finally caged his killer. The story of RICO is thus the untold character in the drama of Paul Castellano's rise and fall, a silent, relentless force that manipulated events from the shadows. It represents the moment when the American legal system finally evolved a weapon potent enough to challenge the ancient, secret society of the Mafia. It shifted the balance of power from the social clubs to the courtroom, making the threat of a life sentence more real and more imminent than the threat of a rival's bullet. For both Castellano and Gotti, RICO was the common enemy that neither could outmaneuver, a testament to the fact that while kings and regimes may change in the underworld, the slow, grinding wheels of justice, once set in motion with the right tools, will eventually crush all who stand in their path. The figure of Sammy, the Bull, Gravano stands as one of the most pivotal and controversial characters in the entire saga of Paul Castellano and John Gotti, a man whose actions irrevocably altered the destiny of the Gambino crime family and whose decision to break the sacred oath of omerta sent shockwaves through the underworld from which it would never fully recover. Gravano was a stark contrast to the cerebral Castellano. He was a man of action, a prolific and efficient killer who had risen through the ranks based on his ruthlessness, his ambition, and his keen understanding of the construction industry, which he used to build a vast and lucrative empire of corruption and extortion. He was, in many ways, the ideal hybrid of the old and new schools. He possessed the street-level toughness and lethal capability that commanded respect from the soldiers, but he also had the business acumen to generate enormous profits, making him valuable in the eyes of a boss like Castellano who prized financial success. Yet, Gravano grew deeply disillusioned with Castellano's reign, resenting what he saw as the boss's insatiable greed and his habit of muscling in on the lucrative deals that Gravano and others had worked hard to secure. This resentment made him a willing and essential participant in Gotti's plot to assassinate Castellano. Gravano was not just a hired gun, he was a strategist and a key ally whose credibility and power base lent crucial weight to the conspiracy. His involvement signaled to other captains that this was not merely the act of a rebellious faction, but a serious move supported by a respected and powerful earner. After the successful coup, Gravano was rewarded with the position of underboss, becoming John Gotti's right-hand man and the operational manager of the Gambino family's vast criminal activities. For a time, the alliance was prosperous, but Gravano soon discovered that the arrogance and recklessness he had despised in Castellano were magnified tenfold in Gotti. He watched in frustration as Gotti's very public persona attracted an unending storm of federal scrutiny, making it nearly impossible to conduct business effectively. He seethed as Gotti demanded larger and larger shares of his construction rackets, echoing the very greed that had doomed Castellano. The final, unforgivable breach came when Gravano, through the federal discovery process, learned that Gotti was secretly recorded at the Rave Night Social Club making disparaging remarks about him and even questioning his loyalty, a betrayal that cut to the very heart of the Mafia's code. Facing a massive RICO indictment that carried a life sentence, and realizing that the man he had helped make boss was now a liability and a potential threat to his very life, Gravano made the most consequential decision of his criminal career: he would cooperate with the government. His decision to flip was not taken lightly, but it was calculated with the same cold precision he applied to his crimes. He understood that the government's case, built on wiretaps, was strong, but with his testimony, it would be invincible. In exchange for a reduced sentence, Gravano provided prosecutors with a detailed, first-hand account of over 30 years of criminal history, including his involvement in 19 murders, the intricate planning of the Castellano hit, and the inner workings of the Gotti administration. His testimony was devastatingly effective. He was a charismatic and credible witness, able to explain the complex hierarchy and rituals of the Mafia in simple, compelling terms. He provided the narrative that connected the dots for the jury, transforming abstract wiretap conversations into a clear story of murder, conspiracy, and racketeering. His cooperation led directly to the conviction of John Gotti and numerous other high-ranking mobsters, effectively decapitating the leadership of the Gambino family. The impact of Gravano's betrayal cannot be overstated. It shattered the myth of omerta, demonstrating that even the most hardened, high-ranking mafiosi could be broken by the prospect of spending the rest of their lives in prison. It created a culture of suspicion and paranoia within the families, as no one could be sure who might be wearing a wire or who might be the next to make a deal with the prosecutors. Gravano's actions completed the destructive cycle that began with Castellano's murder. The king was killed by the prince, and the prince was then destroyed by his most trusted knight. The story of Sammy Gravano is the final, chilling chapter in this saga, a stark lesson in the pragmatic, self-serving nature of the underworld, where loyalty is a currency that is always spent before survival. His legacy is one of ultimate betrayal, a reminder that in the end, the most dangerous enemy is not the one across the street, but the one standing right beside you, calculating his own odds of survival. The opulent and heavily fortified mansion on Toad Hill was far more than a residence. It was a physical manifestation of Paul Castellano's entire philosophy, his ambitions, and ultimately, his fatal disconnect. Known to all as the White House, this sprawling, white brick estate with its imposing gates, surveillance cameras, and meticulously manicured grounds was a world unto itself, a sanctuary designed to project an image of legitimate success and unassailable power. Behind those walls, Castellano cultivated the persona of a corporate chief executive, holding meetings in his lavish living room, often while clad in a silk bathrobe, lecturing his captains on business ethics and profit margins as if they were middle managers in a Fortune 500 company. The interior was a display of gaudy, newfound wealth, filled with expensive but tasteless furnishings, crystal chandeliers, and gold-plated fixtures, a stark contrast to the cramped, smoke-filled social clubs where the real heart of the Mafia continued to beat. This environment was a deliberate creation, a stage upon which he could perform his vision of himself as a modern-day aristocrat, far removed from the gritty street crimes that funded his lifestyle. He believed that by creating this physical and psychological distance, he was insulating himself from the day-to-day dangers of his business and elevating the family's operations to a higher, more sophisticated plane. Yet, in reality, the White House became a gilded cage that isolated him from the very information and relationships that were critical to his survival. The flow of intelligence that once came naturally from mingling in social clubs was now filtered through a handful of sycophants like Tommy Bellotti, who told him what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to know. The resentment this palace fostered among his crew was palpable. To the soldiers and captains risking their freedom on the streets, the mansion was a symbol of Castellano's greed and arrogance, a monument built with their tributes, from which he issued decrees that limited their earning potential. The very security measures designed to protect him, the cameras, the gates, the isolation, also served to highlight his fear and vulnerability, undermining the image of invincibility a mafia boss must project. When he was forced to leave this fortress for his fateful meeting at Sparks Steak House, he was stepping out of his carefully constructed reality and back into the world he had tried to rise above, a world where power was not negotiated in a living room but enforced with a gun on a public street. The journey from Toad Hill to Midtown Manhattan was a journey from his illusion of control back to the brutal, unforgiving truth of his profession. The assassination, therefore, was not just a hit on a man, but an attack on everything his home represented. It was the streets violently rejecting his corporate fantasy, a bloody reminder that no amount of wealth or fortification could protect a leader who has lost the respect of his men. The White House still stands today, a silent and haunting relic of a bygone era, its empty rooms echoing with the ghost of a godfather who mistakenly believed he could wall himself off from the consequences of his own power, a permanent testament to the fact that the highest walls often create the most dangerous blind spots. The murder of Paul Castellano, carried out with such brutal efficiency on a crowded Manhattan street, sent a seismic shockwave through the 5 families of New York, an event that forced every boss and underboss to reassess their own security, their own alliances, and the very nature of their leadership. In the hushed, panicked meetings that followed in social clubs across the city, the initial reaction was one of profound outrage and violation. The sanctity of the boss, a figure who was supposed to be untouchable, had been shattered by an act of unprecedented audacity. The old-school traditionalists, particularly in the Genovese family, which had always operated with a quiet, calculating conservatism, viewed Gotti's move as the ultimate act of treachery, a dangerous and destabilizing precedent that threatened to plunge the entire underworld into chaotic warfare. They understood that if a boss could be killed so easily by his own crew, then no one was safe. The established order, the delicate system of protocols and respect that had prevented all-out war for decades, had been torn to pieces. Yet, this outrage was tempered by a cold, pragmatic fear. John Gotti had not only committed the act, he had immediately and ruthlessly consolidated his power, presenting the commission with a fait accompli. He was now the boss of the nation's most powerful crime family, backed by a loyal and violent faction and led by a man who had just proven he would stop at nothing. To move against him would mean a war that no other family was prepared to fight, a war that would inevitably attract the full, furious attention of every law enforcement agency in the country. The calculus of power shifted from principle to survival. After tense, secret deliberations, the other families, led by the powerful Genovese family, made a reluctant and grim decision. They would recognize John Gotti as the new boss of the Gambino family. This recognition was not an endorsement, it was a surrender to a new, more volatile and dangerous reality. It was an admission that the era of quiet, corporate-style leadership exemplified by Paul Castellano and Carlo Gambino was over, replaced by the cult of personality and brazen violence that Gotti represented. This decision had profound and lasting consequences for the entire American Mafia. It emboldened younger, more ambitious soldiers in other families, showing them that the old guard could be challenged and overthrown. It shifted the culture of the Mafia away from its secretive, business-like roots and towards a more public, more narcissistic, and ultimately more self-destructive model. The Gotti effect meant that flash and intimidation became as important as profit and stability. This new era of spectacle, however, proved to be a catastrophic miscalculation in the long run. While Gotti enjoyed his celebrity status, the FBI and federal prosecutors were building an unassailable case against him, using the very publicity he cultivated as evidence of his leadership in a criminal enterprise. The other families, who had reluctantly accepted his rule, watched as his reign brought a hurricane of legal pressure down upon not just the Gambinos, but upon all of them. The RICO statutes, perfected through the pursuit of Gotti, were now used with devastating effect against the other families. In the end, the broader Mafia's acquiescence to Gotti's coup sealed not only Castellano's fate but also contributed to the decline of their own organizations. By allowing the rules to be broken so flagrantly, they had inadvertently signed their own death warrant, ushering in a period of internal distrust, federal triumph, and irreversible fragmentation. The murder on 46th Street was therefore a point of no return, a single violent act that broke the back of the traditional Cosa Nostra and set it on a path from which it would never truly recover, proving that sometimes, the most damaging blow to a secret society is not an attack from the outside, but a cancer of lawlessness that erupts from within its own ranks. The personal life of Paul Castellano, often obscured by the towering shadow of his criminal empire, provides a crucial and deeply human lens through which to understand the contradictions that ultimately defined him. Behind the imposing gates of the Toad Hill mansion lived not just a mob boss, but a family man, a figure who craved the normalcy and stability that his chosen profession made impossible. He was married to his wife, Nina, for decades, and together they raised several children, attempting to cultivate an image of a respectable, upwardly mobile family within their Staten Island community. Castellano went to great lengths to shield his children from the brutal realities of his work, encouraging them to pursue legitimate careers and build lives far removed from the violence and corruption that funded their privileged existence. He took pride in their accomplishments, seeing their success in the straight world as a form of validation for his own twisted journey. This desire for legitimacy was a powerful, driving force in his life, a yearning that explained his obsession with his corporate facade and his retreat into the opulent isolation of his estate. He wanted to be seen as a businessman, a patriarch, a pillar of the community, not as a common thug. Yet, this carefully constructed domestic world was perpetually at odds with his other life. The constant presence of armed bodyguards, the surveillance cameras, the whispered conversations about murder and betrayal, these were the inescapable intrusions of his true profession. The fear of assassination or arrest was a specter that haunted his home, a tension that could not be erased by any amount of wealth or property. This duality extended to his own moral compass. He could be a doting grandfather in one moment and, in the next, coldly order the death of a business rival or a disloyal soldier. He maintained a long-term, public affair with his maid, Gloria Olarte, a relationship that was an open secret within the family and the mob, further complicating the image of the devoted family man. This hypocrisy was not lost on his underlings, who saw it as another example of the boss believing he was above the rules that governed other men. The pressure of maintaining these two separate and conflicting lives, the ruthless CEO of a criminal syndicate and the loving family patriarch, exacted a heavy psychological toll. It contributed to his isolation and his paranoia, as the line between his personal and professional worlds became increasingly blurred and unsustainable. In the end, his criminal life violently invaded and obliterated his personal one. His assassination on a public street did not just kill a mob boss, it shattered a family, leaving his children to grapple with the grim legacy of their father's double life. The very thing he fought so hard to build, a safe, respectable, and normal existence for his loved ones, was destroyed by the very empire he built to provide it. The story of Paul Castellano's personal life is thus a profound tragedy, a cautionary tale about the impossibility of compartmentalizing a life of crime, and a somber reminder that the walls we build to protect our families can often become the cages that trap them in a legacy of violence and infamy. The financial empire controlled by Paul Castellano was a vast and intricate web of illicit and legitimate enterprises that reached into the very bedrock of New York City's economy, generating revenue on a scale that rivaled many Fortune 500 companies. His genius, if it can be called that, lay in his understanding that true, enduring power in the modern world came not from controlling street corners, but from controlling industries. While the Gambino family under his predecessors had certainly engaged in union corruption and racketeering, Castellano industrialized it, turning it into a systematic, highly profitable business model. His most famous and lucrative domain was the concrete industry, over which he exerted an absolute monopoly. Through a combination of strategic violence, targeted intimidation, and cunning negotiation, he ensured that no significant building project requiring concrete could proceed in New York City without his explicit approval and, more importantly, without paying a substantial tribute to the Gambino family. This was not a simple extortion racket, it was a sophisticated form of corporate takeover. Construction firms were forced to use specific, mob-controlled concrete companies at inflated prices, and contractors knew that winning a bid often depended less on their quote and more on their willingness to cut the family in on the deal. This control over concrete gave him power over the city's skyline, influencing which towers rose and whose fortunes were made. But his reach extended far beyond construction. He had deep ties to the garment industry, controlling trucking and warehouse operations, and ensuring that nothing moved in or out of the city's fashion district without his knowledge and a piece of the action. He maintained a stranglehold on the meat and poultry industry, a throwback to his own legitimate beginnings, using his knowledge of the trade to manipulate prices, hijack shipments, and extort wholesale distributors. His criminal portfolio also included massive gasoline tax fraud schemes, where his operatives would exploit government fuel tax exemptions, creating a network of shell companies and phony transactions that siphoned millions of dollars from state and federal coffers. On top of this were the traditional pillars of mafia income, illegal gambling operations that spanned the city, loan sharking rings that charged usurious interest to desperate borrowers, and the systematic extortion of businesses large and small, from nightclubs to longshoremen on the docks. Castellano approached all of this with the mind of a corporate executive. He demanded detailed financial reports from his captains, held meetings to discuss profit and loss, and strategized on how to expand market share and penetrate new industries. The flow of cash from these diverse operations was staggering, and it funded his opulent lifestyle, his sprawling estate, and the immense political corruption required to keep his empire functioning. Yet, this very financial success was also the source of his downfall. His insistence on a larger and larger share of the profits from his captains, whom he treated like branch managers, bred deep-seated resentment. Men like John Gotti and Sammy Gravano, who were running highly profitable crews of their own, saw Castellano's demands as pure greed, especially as he retreated further into his mansion, seemingly contributing less and less to the day-to-day operations that generated the wealth. His financial empire, for all its brilliance and complexity, was built on a foundation of fear and loyalty that he himself was systematically eroding. The money was flowing, but the respect was draining away, creating a dangerous deficit that would ultimately be settled not with ledgers, but with bullets. In the end, the very empire he built to elevate himself above the common gangster became the reason for his murder, a stark lesson that in the underworld, financial success without the loyalty of your soldiers is the most precarious fortune of all. The law enforcement pursuit of Paul Castellano was a long, painstaking, and technologically evolving campaign that represented a fundamental shift in how America fought organized crime. For the majority of his criminal career, Castellano operated with a degree of impunity, shielded by his low profile, his network of corrupt contacts, and the Mafia's code of silence. Early efforts by agencies like the FBI were often stymied by a lack of hard evidence. They knew he was a powerful figure, but proving it in a court of law was a different matter entirely. The traditional methods of relying on informants from the street level were ineffective against a boss so insulated from the day-to-day crimes. The turning point came with the advancement of electronic surveillance and the passage of new laws like the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. The FBI launched an intensive operation aimed directly at the Gambino family's leadership. They placed listening devices in Castellano's cars, but the real prize was getting inside his inner sanctum, the Todt Hill mansion. In a remarkable feat of surveillance, agents managed to plant bugs in the home itself, including in his kitchen and living room. For years, these devices transmitted the most intimate and damning conversations of the Gambino family's upper echelon. Federal agents listened as Castellano discussed murders, organized rackets, settled disputes between captains, and detailed his vast financial schemes. They heard his contempt for his underlings, his greed, his paranoia, and his detailed knowledge of the family's criminal activities. This was no longer circumstantial evidence, it was a direct audio pipeline into the mind of the boss. The surveillance painted a portrait of a man who was indeed the sophisticated CEO of a criminal corporation, but it also captured his vulnerabilities and his disconnect. The evidence gathered was monumental, and it was all being compiled into a massive RICO case designed to put Castellano and his entire administration away for life. The pressure from this investigation was immense and constant. Castellano was aware he was being watched. He spoke of the bugs in the cars, and his conversations became more guarded, but there was no escape from the omniscient ear of the federal government. This unrelenting legal pressure created an environment of crisis within the Gambino family. It made Castellano appear vulnerable and besieged, qualities that are fatal for a mafia boss. John Gotti and his conspirators used this growing perception of weakness to justify their coup, arguing that a boss facing such a formidable case was a liability who could potentially flip or whose downfall would bring the entire family down. In a tragic irony, the very law enforcement effort designed to imprison Paul Castellano may have inadvertently signed his death warrant by making him a target for his own men. The FBI's tapes, which were intended for a courtroom, ultimately became a catalyst for a gangland execution. Yet, the legacy of this surveillance campaign extended far beyond Castellano's death. The methods perfected in hunting him, the long-term electronic surveillance, the focus on the top of the criminal pyramid, the use of RICO to connect a pattern of crimes, became the blueprint for dismantling the American Mafia. The evidence collected from his home continued to be used in prosecutions for years, ensnaring countless captains and soldiers. The pursuit of Paul Castellano, therefore, marks a pivotal chapter not just in his story, but in the larger history of American justice, representing the moment when the government finally developed the tools, the tactics, and the tenacity to systematically dismantle the powerful and secretive criminal empires that had long operated with a sense of invincibility. The cultural legacy of Paul Castellano, particularly when contrasted with the flamboyant notoriety of his successor, presents a fascinating study in how organized crime has been mythologized in the American consciousness. In the decades since his death, the figure of John Gotti has been immortalized in countless films, television shows, and books, often portrayed as a charismatic anti-hero, a man of the people who defied the system with style and bravado. His flashy suits, his quotable soundbites, and his very public persona have cemented his place in the pantheon of pop culture gangsters, a figure who continues to captivate the public imagination with his tale of a street-smart underdog who took on the establishment, both within the mob and the government. Paul Castellano, by stark contrast, has largely receded into the background of this cultural narrative. He is often remembered only as the man Gotti killed, a footnote in a more exciting story, the dull and greedy king who had to be overthrown by the charismatic prince. This popular perception, however, is a profound oversimplification that misses the true significance of his reign. Castellano represents a different, and in many ways more insidious, archetype of the criminal, not the flashy gangster, but the corrupt businessman. His story is not one of street-level drama, but of boardroom betrayals and the quiet, systemic corruption of legitimate industries. He understood that the most effective criminal enterprise was one that looked like a legitimate corporation, that the most powerful mobster was the one who never had to get his hands dirty. In this sense, Castellano was a more modern, and perhaps more terrifying, figure than Gotti. Gotti's reign was a throwback to the gangsterism of the Prohibition era, a spectacle of violence and defiance that was ultimately self-defeating. Castellano's vision was forward-looking, a blueprint for how organized crime could evolve to survive and thrive in a modern, regulated economy. His failure was not in his vision, but in his execution. He lost the loyalty of his men because he forgot that the Mafia, at its core, is a primitive institution built on personal loyalty and fear, not corporate profit-sharing. The fact that his model failed does not make it less significant. In an age of white-collar crime and corporate malfeasance, the story of Paul Castellano, the boss in the boardroom, the predator in a suit, is arguably more relevant than ever. He serves as a dark mirror to the legitimate business world, a reminder that the line between a corporate raider and a mobster can be perilously thin, and that the pursuit of profit without ethics can lead to the same destructive ends, whether in a Wall Street skyscraper or a mafia social club. The cultural fascination with Gotti speaks to our romanticization of the outlaw, the rebellious individual. The relative obscurity of Castellano speaks to our discomfort with the banality of evil, with the cold, calculating, and utterly unglamorous reality of systemic corruption. His legacy is a silent, cautionary one, a ghost in the machine of American capitalism, reminding us that the most dangerous criminals are not always the ones who make the headlines, but often the ones who quietly own the printing press. The final, enduring mystery surrounding Paul Castellano is not who killed him, for that is known, but rather what his ultimate fate would have been had John Gotti's ambition not intervened on that cold December evening. It is the great unanswered question that hangs over his entire story, a haunting, what if, that invites us to consider an alternate history for the Gambino crime family and for the American Mafia itself. The federal government's case against him was formidable, a sprawling RICO indictment built on a foundation of hundreds of hours of secret recordings from his own home and cars. The evidence was damning and extensive, detailing his role as the head of a vast criminal enterprise. Had he lived, it is almost a certainty that he would have faced trial, and given the strength of the evidence, a conviction and a life sentence were the most probable outcomes. But how would Paul Castellano, the man who prized his dignity and his self-image as a corporate executive above all else, have handled such a humiliating downfall? Would he have gone to prison silently, accepting his fate as a cost of doing business, and attempted to rule his empire from behind bars, as his predecessor Carlo Gambino had done for a time? Or would the pressure and the prospect of dying in a concrete cell have broken him? This is the central, unanswerable dilemma. The man who so deeply craved legitimacy and respect might have found the disgrace of a public trial and a life behind bars unbearable. It is not beyond the realm of possibility that, faced with the utter collapse of his carefully constructed world, he might have done the unthinkable and followed the path of his underboss, Sammy Gravano, by cooperating with the government. The prospect of Paul Castellano, the boss of bosses, breaking omerta is a staggering one. His testimony would have been cataclysmic, potentially even more devastating than Gravano's, reaching into the highest echelons of not just his own family, but the other 4 families, corrupt politicians, and compromised business leaders across the country. The entire edifice of organized crime in America might have crumbled under the weight of his revelations. Conversely, his steadfast refusal to cooperate would have cemented his legacy as a man of the old code, a true man of honor, in the twisted mythology of the Mafia, who took his secrets to the grave. Gotti and his conspirators justified the murder by claiming Castellano was weak and a potential informant, but they preempted any possibility of ever knowing the truth. By pulling the triggers outside Sparks Steakhouse, they did not just kill a man, they killed a potential future, erasing the answer to this critical question forever. They replaced this uncertainty with their own, more flamboyant and ultimately more destructive brand of leadership, which attracted even greater law enforcement scrutiny and led to the rapid decline of their family. In this light, Castellano's assassination was not just a coup, it was a catastrophic miscalculation that traded a potential, manageable legal threat for a guaranteed and relentless storm of federal attention. The ghost of Paul Castellano, therefore, is not just the ghost of a murdered boss, but the ghost of a road not taken, a path of quiet, corporate crime that was violently closed off in favor of a short-lived, explosive, and self-immolating spectacle. His death sealed his legend in one way, but it also forever obscured his true character, leaving us to wonder whether he would have been the Mafia's last great silent king or its most devastating and royal informant. The story of Paul Castellano is a dark and enduring American epic, a saga that stretches from the desperate hopes of immigrant parents to the gilded halls of unimaginable power, and ends in a sudden, shocking burst of violence on a city street. It is a narrative that encompasses the entirety of the 20th century criminal experience, reflecting the evolution of the American Mafia from a secretive Sicilian brotherhood into a sophisticated, corporate-style enterprise, and its subsequent fragmentation under the weight of its own internal contradictions and external pressures. Castellano was, in many ways, the architect of this modern Mafia, a visionary who understood that the future of organized crime lay not in the back alleys but in the boardrooms, not in petty theft but in the systematic corruption of entire industries. His rise to power was a testament to his intelligence, his patience, and his ruthless understanding of economics and human weakness. He built financial empires from concrete and corruption, amassing wealth and influence on a scale that previous mob bosses could scarcely have imagined. He sought to create a legacy of legitimacy, to transform the Gambino family into a shadowy holding company and himself into its reclusive, respected CEO, insulated from the blood and grime of the streets. Yet, this very ambition became the instrument of his destruction. In his quest for a corporate crown, he lost touch with the feudal nature of his kingdom. He forgot that his power ultimately rested not on profit margins, but on the loyalty of men whose world was defined by violence, honor, and immediate gain. His isolation in the Todt Hill mansion, his perceived greed, and his disdain for the old ways bred a resentment that festered into a mutiny. The coup led by John Gotti was not merely a power grab, it was a violent rejection of Castellano's entire philosophy, a brutal reassertion of the Mafia's street-level soul. Gotti's subsequent reign, with its flashy suits and public bravado, was the antithesis of everything Castellano had worked for, and it proved to be spectacularly short-sighted, bringing down the full force of the federal government and crippling the family for a generation. The contrasting legacies of these two men, Castellano, the corporate strategist who fell to a street-level hit, and Gotti, the street brawler who was undone by his own celebrity, form a perfect and tragic symmetry. Castellano's life and death serve as a timeless parable about the nature of power, a stark reminder that no empire, whether legitimate or illicit, can survive when its leader becomes disconnected from the source of his own authority. It is a story of hubris and betrayal, of the eternal conflict between the old and the new, and of the inescapable truth that in the ruthless calculus of the underworld, every king, no matter how powerful, is ultimately living on borrowed time, awaiting the moment when a hungrier, more ambitious rival decides that the throne is theirs for the taking. The echo of the gunshots outside Sparks Steakhouse has faded, but the lessons of Paul Castellano's rise and fall continue to resonate, a chilling reminder of the fragile line between immense power and utter oblivion. We have journeyed through the rise and fall of a king, and the bloody ascent and catastrophic reign of the man who betrayed him. If you found this deep dive into the hidden history of the American Mafia compelling, if you were fascinated by the Shakespearean drama of Paul Castellano's life and death, then please show your support. Like this video, subscribe to the channel for more meticulously researched stories from the underworld, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration of the truths that lurk in the shadows. Your engagement helps us continue to bring these complex, full-length narratives to you. Thank you for watching. The echoes of Paul Castellano's reign and the violent coup that ended it did not simply vanish with his death or even with the subsequent imprisonment of John Gotti. Instead, they rippled forward through time, shaping the very DNA of the Gambino family and influencing the strategies of law enforcement for decades to come. The Castellano-Gotti War became the defining internal conflict of the modern American Mafia, a case study in failed succession and the dangers of charismatic but reckless leadership. In the years that followed Gotti's life sentence, the Gambino family, once the proud and powerful flagship of organized crime, was forced into a desperate survival mode. The bosses who followed, men like John Jr. Gotti, Nicky Carazzo, and others, operated under a constant state of siege, their tenures often measured in months rather than years, each one quickly indicted under the same RICO statutes that had been perfected for their predecessors. The family fractured, devolving from a centralized, corporate-like entity back into a collection of semi-autonomous crews, each focusing on lower-profile, less flashy criminal enterprises to avoid the devastating spotlight that Gotti's flamboyance had attracted. The old, sprawling rackets in concrete and garbage hauling that Castellano had mastered became far too dangerous and difficult to control under intense federal scrutiny. The family's influence over the New York waterfront, a cornerstone of its power for generations, withered away. The new generation of mobsters were shadows of their forebears, often more concerned with avoiding wiretaps and informants than with building criminal empires. This protracted decline was the ultimate legacy of the Sparks Steakhouse hit. Gotti's victory, it turned out, was Pyrrhic. He won the throne only to preside over the systematic dismantling of his own kingdom. The chaos he unleashed ultimately proved Castellano's core point, that loud, public leadership was a death sentence for a secret society. In a bitter historical irony, the modern Gambino family has, in many ways, quietly returned to the Castellano model, operating with a lower profile, focusing on financial crimes and digital schemes, and avoiding the media spotlight, but it does so from a position of vastly diminished power and influence. It is a ghost of its former self, a testament to the fact that the violent rupture of December 1985 did not lead to a glorious new era, but to a long, slow, and irreversible decay. The story of Paul Castellano is therefore not concluded. It is a cycle that continues to turn, a warning etched into the history of organized crime that the pursuit of power, when untempered by wisdom and a connection to the foundations of one's authority, contains the seeds of its own destruction. The white brick mansion on Toad Hill still stands, a silent monument to a king who dreamed of a corporate empire, while the streets of New York tell a different tale, one of ambition, betrayal, and the enduring truth that in the underworld, the loudest revolutions often end in the quietest of ruins. The enduring fascination with the life and death of Paul Castellano lies not in the simple facts of his murder, but in the profound and universal themes his story embodies, themes that transcend the specific world of organized crime and speak to the fundamental human conditions of ambition, power, and the inevitable confrontation with mortality. He is a figure who exists in a somber gray area, neither a romanticized outlaw like John Gotti nor a purely monstrous villain. he was a complex man whose strengths were inextricably linked to his fatal weaknesses. His intelligence and strategic vision, which allowed him to build a financial empire that corrupted the very infrastructure of New York City, were the same qualities that led him to believe he was untouchable, insulating himself in a palace of his own making until he could no longer hear the whispers of his own impending doom. His story is a classical tragedy in the truest sense, a narrative of a man of great stature brought low not by a random act of fate, but by a fatal flaw in his own character, his hubris, his disconnect, his inability to see that the loyalty of men cannot be purchased with profit shares alone, but must be earned through shared struggle and respect. We are captivated by his tale because it holds up a dark mirror to our own aspirations and fears. It asks us unsettling questions about the price of success and the corrupting nature of absolute power. It forces us to consider the walls we build around our own lives, the isolation we create in the pursuit of safety and status, and the potential for betrayal that lurks when we lose touch with those whose support we depend upon. The image of Castellano, a man who controlled millions and commanded life and death authority over a vast hidden empire, being cut down as helplessly as any common citizen on a public street, is a chilling memento mori, a stark reminder of the fragility of all power and the ultimate democracy of death. His legacy is not one of glory, but of caution. It serves as a permanent lesson for any who seek to wield authority, whether in the underworld, the corporate world, or the political arena, that power is a delicate ecosystem that requires constant tending, that perception is as important as reality, and that no throne, no matter how well fortified, is secure from the ambitions of the hungry. The echo of the gunshots outside Sparks Steakhouse fades, but the story of Paul Castellano endures, a haunting and eternal parable about the rise and fall of an American king, a solemn warning that the highest peaks of power are often the most treacherous, and that the fall from them is always sudden, brutal, and final. The physical landscape of New York City itself serves as an unmarked and ever-present monument to the reign of Paul Castellano, a silent testament to the vast, hidden power he wielded over the economic life of the world's most famous metropolis. To walk through the city today is to traverse a map of his influence, though his name is unknown to the millions who live and work within the structures his criminal enterprise helped to build and control. The very skyline, that iconic forest of steel and glass, bears the indelible imprint of his ambition. The towering condominiums and corporate headquarters that define the horizons of Midtown and the financial district quite literally stand on a foundation of Gambino concrete, poured by companies he monopolized through a ruthless combination of intimidation, corruption, and strategic violence. The skeletons of these buildings, their steel frameworks erected by unions whose leadership answered to him, are the lasting architecture of his corporate vision for the Mafia. Beyond the skyscrapers, his ghost lingers in the mundane rhythms of city life. The garbage that was collected from restaurants and businesses for decades was hauled away by carting companies under his thumb, their prices inflated and their routes controlled by his edict. The meat delivered to butcher shops and high-end steakhouses, an echo of his own family's humble beginnings, often passed through a supply chain he manipulated with threats and extortion. The garments hanging in store windows in the fashion district were transported in trucks whose drivers paid tribute to his regime. This was the genius and the menace of Paul Castellano's model of power. It was not about dominating a single neighborhood, but about weaving his organization into the essential, everyday functions of the city itself. He understood that controlling the sinews of commerce, the concrete for construction, the trucks for transportation, the unions for labor, was far more powerful and profitable than any number of bank robberies or street-level drug deals. He became a silent, parasitic partner in the growth and operation of New York, siphoning off millions of dollars into his own coffers while remaining almost entirely invisible to the public he exploited. This deep, systemic corruption is his most significant and damaging legacy, far more enduring than the sensational violence of his death. While John Gotti's legacy is one of tabloid headlines and a self-destructive cult of personality, Castellano's is one of quiet, pervasive rot. The city moved on, the buildings remained, and the institutions he corrupted were eventually cleansed, but the memory of his control is a permanent part of New York's history, a shadow that fell across its most powerful industries. His story is a reminder that the most formidable criminals are not always the ones who capture the public imagination with their audacity, but but often those who, like Paul Castellano, work in the deep, silent currents of the economy, bending the system to their will until the very city around them becomes, for a time, a monument to their crime. The physical landscape of New York City itself serves as an unmarked and ever-present monument to the reign of Paul Castellano, a silent testament to the vast, hidden power he wielded over the economic life of the world's most famous metropolis. To walk through the city today is to traverse a map of his influence, though his name is unknown to the millions who live and work within the structures his criminal enterprise helped to build and control. The very skyline, that iconic forest of steel and glass, bears the indelible imprint of his ambition. The towering condominiums and corporate headquarters that define the horizons of Midtown and the financial district quite literally stand on a foundation of Gambino concrete, poured by companies he monopolized through a ruthless combination of intimidation, corruption, and strategic violence. The skeletons of these buildings, their steel frameworks erected by unions whose leadership answered to him, are the lasting architecture of his corporate vision for the Mafia. Beyond the skyscrapers, his ghost lingers in the mundane rhythms of city life. The garbage that was collected from restaurants and businesses for decades was hauled away by carting companies under his thumb, their prices inflated and their routes controlled by his edict. The meat delivered to butcher shops and high-end steakhouses, an echo of his own family's humble beginnings, often passed through a supply chain he manipulated with threats and extortion. The garments hanging in store windows in the fashion district were transported in trucks whose drivers paid tribute to his regime. This was the genius and the menace of Paul Castellano's model of power. It was not about dominating a single neighborhood, but about weaving his organization into the essential, everyday functions of the city itself. He understood that controlling the sinews of commerce, the concrete for construction, the trucks for transportation, the unions for labor, was far more powerful and profitable than any number of bank robberies or street-level drug deals. He became a silent, parasitic partner in the growth and operation of New York, siphoning off millions of dollars into his own coffers while remaining almost entirely invisible to the public he exploited. This deep, systemic corruption is his most significant and damaging legacy, far more enduring than the sensational violence of his death. While John Gotti's legacy is one of tabloid headlines and a self-destructive cult of personality, Castellano's is one of quiet, pervasive rot. The city moved on, the buildings remained, and the institutions he corrupted were eventually cleansed, but the memory of his control is a permanent part of New York's history, a shadow that fell across its most powerful industries. His story is a reminder that the most formidable criminals are not always the ones who capture the public imagination with their audacity, but often those who, like Paul Castellano, work in the deep, silent currents of the economy, bending the system to their will until the very city around them becomes, for a time, a monument to their crime. The story of Paul Castellano, now complete in its telling, leaves us not with a simple conclusion but with a lingering and profound resonance, a complex echo of a life that forces us to confront the very nature of the American narrative itself. He was a man who embodied the ultimate paradox of the immigrant dream, achieving a level of wealth and influence his parents could never have imagined, yet doing so by perverting the very principles of hard work and legitimate enterprise that dream was founded upon. His journey from the modest streets of Bensonhurst to the opulent isolation of Todt Hill is a dark refraction of the classic rags to riches tale, a cautionary fable about the corrupting allure of power and the moral compromises hidden behind the facade of success. In the end, the meticulous, corporate empire he built was not destroyed by a rival family or even solely by the federal government, but by the more primal, elemental forces of human ambition and betrayal that he himself had underestimated. His successor, John Gotti, momentarily triumphed by appealing to these baser instincts, only to lead the organization into a spectacular and self-inflicted collapse. The contrasting legacies of these two men, Castellano, the quiet corporatist, and Gotti, the flamboyant revolutionary, represent the two doomed halves of a broken whole, demonstrating that neither pure calculation nor pure audacity can sustain a criminal enterprise in the face of a modern, determined justice system and the inherent frailties of human loyalty. The saga of Paul Castellano is more than a history, it is a permanent part of the American tapestry, a grim reminder that the pursuit of power is a dangerous and all-consuming game where the stakes are ultimately one's very soul and legacy. It is a story that continues to captivate because it is, at its heart, a human story, a story of ambition, family, pride, and the inescapable consequences of our choices. The final image is not of a king on his throne, but of a man on a pavement, his blood staining the city he sought to control, a silent testament to the fact that no amount of planning, no fortress, and no fortune can ultimately guard against the relentless turning of fate's wheel. And so we arrive at the end of our journey, having traced the intricate and bloody path of a man who sought to build an empire in the shadows, only to be destroyed by the very darkness he called home. The story of Paul Castellano is now complete, a sprawling epic of ambition, power, and the inescapable gravity of fate. We have witnessed his meticulous rise from the streets of Brooklyn to the pinnacle of the American underworld, his ambitious vision to transform a brutal criminal organization into a corporate entity, and his tragic downfall at the hands of a man who represented everything he despised. We have seen how his intelligence and strategic mind were both his greatest assets and his ultimate blind spots, leading him to construct a gilded fortress that isolated him from the grim realities upon which his power was built. We have observed the fatal schism between his corporate aspirations and the street-level loyalties of his men, a disconnect that festered into a mutiny and culminated in those shocking moments of public execution outside Sparks Steakhouse. We have followed the aftermath, as his killer, John Gotti, seized the throne with audacious brutality, only to lead the Gambino family into a new era of self-destructive spectacle and, ultimately, to his own ruin in a prison cell. We have delved into the legal revolution of the RICO Act, the devastating betrayal of Sammy Gravano, and the long, slow decline of a criminal dynasty that never recovered from the internal war between these two opposing visions of power. Through it all, the figure of Paul Castellano has remained a complex and haunting presence, not a hero, not a simple villain, but a profoundly human figure whose strengths and weaknesses were tragically intertwined. His life serves as a timeless parable, a stark reminder that power is a fragile construct, that no leader can survive by distancing themselves from the source of their own authority, and that the pursuit of legacy is often a race against the inevitable forces of betrayal and time. His blood on the pavement of 46th Street was the final, brutal period at the end of a long and convoluted sentence, a life story that continues to captivate because it holds a dark mirror to our own understanding of ambition, success, and the price of power. The echoes have faded, the players have left the stage, but the lessons remain, etched into history as a solemn warning for all who would seek to rule in the shadows. The story of the Godfather who never saw it coming is over, but its echoes will linger, a ghost in the machine of American history, forever a part of the city he could not truly conquer. And so we find ourselves at the quiet after the storm, the long silence that follows the final, echoing gunshot. The tale of Paul Castellano is not merely a chronicle of criminal enterprise, it is a profound meditation on the architecture of power itself, a blueprint of a kingdom built on sand, destined to be washed away by the tides of ambition and time. We have navigated the entire spectrum of his existence, from the hopeful immigrant roots buried in the soil of Bensonhurst to the cold, hard reality of his death on a Manhattan street, a journey that mirrors the rise and fall of empires throughout history. We have seen how his keen intellect, a mind capable of orchestrating the silent takeover of entire industries, became clouded by the very isolation that wealth and power afforded him. We have witnessed the fatal disconnect between the boardroom and the street, between the man in the silk robe issuing decrees and the soldiers in the social clubs who felt the sting of his greed and the distance of his rule. The coup that ended his life was not an anomaly, it was the inevitable result of a leader who forgot that his authority, however vast, was ultimately a grant from the very men he came to view as beneath him. The subsequent reign of John Gotti, with its blinding flash of celebrity and its catastrophic collapse, stands as the perfect counterpoint to Castellano's quiet corporatism, proving that neither extreme, the cold, removed CEO nor the brash, publicity-hungry gangster, could ultimately survive the converging forces of internal betrayal and external justice. The legacy of this conflict is written in the faded glory of the Gambino family itself, an organization that never recovered its former might, a ghost ship adrift on the currents of a modern world that has little room for its old-world rituals and brutal codes. The story of Paul Castellano is, therefore, a closed loop, a complete cycle of ascent, reign, and ruin. It asks of us not to mourn a fallen king, but to understand the conditions of his fall. It challenges us to see the universal truths within this specific, violent world, that power requires constant tending, that loyalty is a currency more valuable than gold, and that the highest walls often create the most dangerous blind spots. His life is a permanent fixture in the gallery of American history, a dark portrait of ambition unmoored from humanity, a cautionary tale that whispers across the decades from the rain-slicked street where it all ended, reminding us that in the relentless pursuit of power, the greatest enemy is often the reflection in the gilded mirror. The narrative of Paul Castellano now rests, its final chapter not written in ink but etched into the collective memory of a city and a nation, a permanent scar on the face of the American century. We have traversed the full, sweeping arc of this man's life, from the unassuming origins in a Brooklyn neighborhood to the dizzying, perilous heights of commanding the most powerful criminal syndicate in the United States, and finally to his brutal, public demise that served as a violent punctuation mark to an era. We have dissected the very anatomy of his power, examining how his formidable intellect and visionary grasp of economic leverage allowed him to construct an empire of corruption that reached into the concrete of the skyscrapers and the very meat on the plates of New Yorkers. We have observed with a historian's eye the fatal flaws that grew like cracks in a foundation, the arrogance born of isolation, the greed that alienated his most vital lieutenants, and the critical miscalculation that the loyalty of violent men could be bought with profit shares alone, without the binding agent of shared struggle and respect. The betrayal by John Gotti was not a random act of treachery but the predictable eruption of a tension that Castellano himself had created, a fundamental clash between a corporate future and a street-level past. And we have seen the bitter irony that Gotti's victory was hollow, his own reign a spectacular inferno that consumed everything in its path, including himself, thereby proving the inherent instability of the path he championed. The legacy left in the wake of these two titans is one of profound desolation for the kingdom they fought over, a once mighty family reduced, fractured, and forever diminished, a stark testament to the fact that civil war, even in the underworld, leaves no true victors, only survivors amidst the ruins. The story of Paul Castellano is now complete, a dark star in the constellation of American crime, its light a somber warning that travels across time. It concludes not with a verdict of good or evil, but with a deeper, more enduring understanding of the mechanics of power and the universal truths about ambition, loyalty, and the inescapable consequences of building a throne upon a foundation of fear and avarice. The final silence has fallen, the last word spoken, leaving only the echo of a lesson learned too late by the king in his castle, a lesson for all who would seek absolute power, that the crown is always, and forever, heavier than it appears, and the fall from grace is a descent that ends only one way. And so we find ourselves at the final, quiet shore of this epic narrative, the last grains of sand slipping through the hourglass of a life that was as monumental as it was tragically flawed. The story of Paul Castellano is now complete, a sprawling American saga that has unfolded across these pages in all its grim and gritty detail, from the humble, hopeful beginnings in the heart of an immigrant community to the dizzying, gilded peak of criminal sovereignty, and finally to the sudden, shocking void of an assassination that reverberated through the very foundations of the underworld. We have meticulously charted the course of this man's remarkable journey, examining the keen, calculating mind that saw the future of crime not in the alleyway but in the boardroom, the ambitious vision that sought to sanitize violence with the language of profit margins and corporate takeovers. We have stood witness to the construction of his financial empire, an intricate web of coercion and corruption that ensnared unions, industries, and the very infrastructure of a world city, generating wealth on a scale that would be the envy of any legitimate enterprise. We have observed the fatal disconnect that grew like a cancer within his reign, the physical and psychological isolation within the Toad Hill mansion that bred a dangerous myopia, blinding him to the simmering resentments and naked ambitions festering in the social clubs he no longer deigned to visit. We have analyzed the perfect storm of his downfall, the looming specter of the RICO statute, the perceived greed that turned his captains against him, and the rise of a charismatic rival in John Gotti who embodied the very street-level ethos Castellano sought to transcend. We have seen the brutal, public execution that served as the violent, definitive end to his corporate experiment, and we have traced the bloody aftermath through Gotti's own spectacular self-immolation and the long, slow decline of the Gambino family into a shadow of its former self. Every facet of this tale has been explored, every motive examined, every consequence considered. The narrative is now whole. The life of Paul Castellano, in its entirety, stands before us not as a simple morality play, but as a complex and enduring human tragedy, a chilling reminder of the corrupting nature of absolute power and the immutable law that those who live by the sword, or by the corporate raider's silent, equally lethal directive, shall ultimately perish by it. The final curtain has fallen. The echoes of gunfire have faded into the relentless noise of the city that continues, indifferent, above his grave. The story is told. The account is closed. The legacy of Paul Castellano extends far beyond the confines of his own life and death, weaving itself into the very fabric of how we understand not only the history of organized crime but also the perennial dynamics of power, loyalty, and betrayal in any complex human organization. His story, now fully told, serves as a dark and enduring archetype, a case study that continues to be relevant in boardrooms and government halls as much as in the remnants of the underworld he once commanded. We have followed every step of his path, from the formative years in Brooklyn where he learned the dual lessons of his father's butcher trade and the neighborhood street-level power struggles, to his strategic ascent under the wing of Carlo Gambino, where he honed a philosophy of crime that valued quiet infiltration over loud intimidation. We witnessed his reign at the pinnacle of the Gambino family, a period marked by unprecedented wealth and influence achieved through the ruthless corporatization of corruption, seizing control of the construction, garbage hauling, and garment industries with a chilling efficiency that demonstrated his unique genius. We saw the fatal flaws in his grand design, the isolation that bred paranoia, the greed that alienated his most productive earners, and the arrogant belief that his underlings would remain loyal to a leader who no longer shared their world or understood their ambitions. This set the stage for the inevitable coup, a conspiracy born in the very streets he had left behind, led by John Gotti, a man who represented the antithesis of everything Castellano stood for. We have recounted the shocking precision of his public execution, an event that was less a murder and more a political statement, a violent rejection of his entire corporate vision for the Mafia. And we have traced the bitter aftermath, where Gotti's subsequent reign of flashy, self-destructive spectacle proved just as doomed, leading to the Gambino family's precipitous decline and the end of an era. Every chapter of this saga has been laid bare, from the intimate details of his personal life and his complex relationship with his family to the vast, hidden economic empire he built and the relentless legal pursuit that helped seal his fate. The narrative is now complete, a full and comprehensive account that leaves no stone unturned. The life of Paul Castellano stands as a finished portrait, a somber and conclusive lesson in the limits of power and the inescapable consequences of forgetting the human element, the loyalty, the respect, the shared purpose, that must fuel any empire, whether legitimate or illicit. The final word has been spoken, the last analysis made. His story is over, but its echoes will forever serve as a warning, a timeless reminder that no throne is ever truly secure, and that the highest walls often hide the most profound vulnerabilities. We have journeyed through the rise and fall of a king, and the bloody ascent and catastrophic reign of the man who betrayed him. If you found this deep dive into the hidden history of the American Mafia compelling, if you were fascinated by the Shakespearean drama of Paul Castellano's life and death, then please show your support. Like this video, subscribe to the channel for more meticulously researched stories from the underworld, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration of the truths that lurk in the shadows. Your engagement helps us continue to bring these complex, full-length narratives to you. Thank you for watching.